So the speaker tonight is Henry Yeung from the Professor of Department of Geography, National University of Singapore. Received his PhD from Manchester in England. Henry's research interests cover theories of transnational corporations, global production networks, global value chains, East Asian firms and development states in the global economy. He's conducted extensive research in Hong Kong firms, in Southeast Asia, and regionalization of Singaporean companies and the emergence of leading Asian firms in the global economy. Henry has editorships of Environment and Planning A, Economic Geography, Global Network, a Journal of Transnational Affairs, Springer Briefs in Digital Science. Until 2013, he was editor of Review of International Political Economy and International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. And then in his spare time, he also sits on 17 editorial boards as well. So in July of 2014, Henry was awarded a $4 million strategic grant by the National University of Singapore to establish a global production network center at NUS. It's my great pleasure to introduce Henry Yeung.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael, for your very generous introduction, and to Michael also for, first of all, kindly invited me some time ago together with John, and I think maybe you are somewhere, to originally attend the World Congress of the Association in Bangkok. But obviously, you know, the military didn't like us, so decided to have a coup d'etat. The conference had to be cancelled. So I'm really glad that I can make a presence and present this particular paper to an audience. Let me just sort of preface by saying that I understand that many of you are experts in regional science, and I come in as an economic geographer on the kind of softer side. So I have relatively less modeling or ability and experience. So today my talk is primarily qualitative in nature. So it's conceptual plus a bit of empirical illustration, but more importantly, because of the nature of the journal, the full paper has already been written. The paper is written in such a way to draw out implications for regional development policy and practice. So that's the sort of main sort of angle of this paper. I've entitled the paper Regional Development in the Global Economy because the idea is to think of regional development not as just an endogenous phenomenon, but as a phenomenon that require, of course, endogenous activity and so on, but also in connection to global processes. So here we are talking about regional global interfaces and how those interfaces impact on regional development. And I've been working on this idea of global production networks with a group of colleagues, and we've developed some of the sort of concepts such as strategic coupling. Today I shall introduce briefly the idea, but sort of deepen it further and show it in the sort of East Asian development, regional development context, and then talk about some of the policy angles. After a brief introduction, I will focus quite a bit on how we can make strategic coupling work for regional development. I will explain very briefly what strategic coupling means in this context, and of course talk about what kind of policy and practice we can develop to promote strategic coupling. Now, before I go into the idea of strategic coupling, let me sort of introduce the idea of global production networks or global value chains, as some of you will know. This is an important phenomenon because the world now is primarily organized through GPNs and GVCs. Some 80% of world trade take place within GVCs and GPNs. So it's no longer just about a firm doing all of the activities, but through all this fragmentation of production across space, international relocation of economic activities, outsourcing, what have you, you will find that every industry is dominated by a range of firms together with their suppliers, strategic partners, and so on. Each of this is a chain or a network. And it's this kind of networks and chains operating at a global scale that we believe will shape developmental outcome at the regional scale. So it's in that spirit that I took a quote from a World Bank's report that GVCs and GPNs are the world economy's backbone today and central nerve system. So we are not talking about sort of individual firms anymore, not talking about trade in final finished goods. as the sort of way to understand the world economy. Of course, there is a parallel development about value-added trade, and some economists have been trying to measure this now in order to understand the true value of trade between countries, so on and so forth. I'm not going to it, just to sort of sensitize you to that. This map gives you a sense of what this idea of trade in intermediate goods is about. If you look at the small chart, it shows you trade in intermediate goods in sort of yellowish color, and it has grown tremendously from 1995 as a proportion of total trade, right? Intermediate goods, consumption goods, and capital goods, all right, to more than as the largest block of trade in international trade. And if you look at the right-hand side, the large panel, it shows the data in 2008 intra-regional trade in intermediate goods. You will find that, in fact, the largest chunk of trade in intermediate goods tends to happen within regions, macro regions, I should rephrase, since we are regional science, that's why. By that we mean within Europe, within Asia, and within North America. In a way, we can understand how that kind of thing works, because obviously you have key suppliers producing certain parts in one country in macro region 1, and ship it to a factory B in another country of the same region, and so on and so forth. It's different company or same firm within the same production network. So it's in that sense that we are in this kind of world situation in terms of real world economy. This map is produced by the Fung Global Institute supply chain study. Okay, if that is the sort of broader economic organizational backdrop of the global economy, how do we understand regional development as, our cup of tea? Even though I don't do modeling as an economic geographer, we are always interested in regional development outcomes. Yeah. So Michael Taylor used to talk about this in his 2009 piece in the same journal, how in a rapidly developing, changing global economy, can the dynamics of local and regional economies be better understood? And I would like to argue that one of the answers to that how is to understand the dynamics of both regional happenings, if you like, and global dynamics. So let me introduce briefly this idea of strategic coupling, which is a way for us to understand, if you like, endogenous activities in a region and global processes. In our earlier work, together with some colleagues, we have developed this concept to argue that you have actors in regions. Actors could be firms, could be government agency, could be NGOs, labor unions, and so on, who conscientiously build links with global players, global actors, and in so doing, pull in those global players, right? And those global players, we see them as global production networks and so on. And the successful outcome of this is considered a strategic coupling taking place. So I will argue that strategic coupling is the interactive effects of regional dynamics, so propulsive growth within a particular region, and GPN imperatives. There are specific imperatives that operate at the global production networks level outside regional economies, which we need to understand in order to understand why certain regions get more of the better value added activities than others. So that's the sort of fundamental argument. However, the idea of strategic coupling seems to be all good, all positive. So the reality is that there are regions which are sort of coupled in to global production networks, got locked in to the wrong kind of activity maybe, and over time needs to decouple because you need to sort of dislodge from a sort of not so good system or production networks, and try then over a period of time recouple into a different kind, maybe better global production networks. Later on I will show you some examples of, say, electronics industry and so on and so forth. So in that sense, there is scope for thinking of policy, regional development policy of thinking about how to couple into the right kind of global production networks and how to sort of over time build capacity in the region in order to benefit more from those GPN activities. So that's sort of what this talk is really about. Example I'm going to give you is looking at East Asia, where I come from and more familiar with. This essentially just gives you a sense of different waves of industrialization taking place. First wave, Japan, and second wave is the four tiger economies of South Korea, Taiwan, and then somewhere Hong Kong and Singapore, and then third wave will be like the Thailand, Malaysia, and so on, and China is the more recent wave in terms of industrialization. I think this story, roughly, most people have a good sense. Question is, if we were to focus on some of their most productive regions, within those economies and countries, how do we understand the sort of growth over time? So, sort of just give a bit more sense of what strategic coupling means. It actually refers to both the territorial dimension of the dynamics. So territorial in this case is at the regional scale. Michael Stopper calls this regional assets, and he has his holy trinity to describe this in terms of technology, organization, and knowledge. So these are what we commonly understood as regional assets and social relations. So regional institutions, and in geography we use a term called institutional thickness, and so on and so forth. All these are territorialized dynamics. In all the regions we come from, we find some versions, combinations of this. Some are more pro-growth, some are less, and so on and so forth. For strategic coupling to take place, you also need network dynamics, right? The kind of GPN imperatives I was saying earlier, right? Just because a region has all the right dimensions, right assets, doesn't necessarily mean you will couple successfully with global production networks. Why? Because we need to understand what are the imperatives of global production networks. There are a few of them. Here, of course, I have to go very briefly. And these logics are to do with global competition. One is to do cost efficiency. I think most of us can accept that. Cost is an issue. But very often, production gets globalized, gets fragmented across space, not just due to cheaper cost, but also due to market access, market development factors. It could also due to financialization, the rise of stock market capitalism, if you like. So if you look at, there are studies showing that American corporations tend to be driven by shorter term interests because of Wall Street pressure. In so doing, outsource production, because production is more a liability than an asset for the CEO in order to gain higher share prices. So leads to outsourcing, right? So financial discipline actually compel lead firms to outsource rather than to do everything by yourself, which in a way again makes sense, I think. Finally, is to do risk minimization. If you today put all production in one location, is highly risky due to whatever factors, political, physical, environmental, and so on and so forth. So these are the imperatives that drive GPN dynamics. And you have territorial dynamics above. In one of our earlier pieces of work, we sort of use this figure to explain how strategic coupling works. Regional development is in the middle. Right? Regional development, we define it as value capture. A region able to capture the value, as much of the value it sort of creates, all right? Whether it's in the production of intermediate goods or in the production of final goods or a mix of all of this. You need to understand global production networks up there, and then you need to, of course, understand regional institutions on the right, and of course below will be the regional assets that we commonly know of. And it's through this sort of triangle relationship that the successful coupling of regional assets with global production networks and facilitated by regional institutions above that enable us to understand regional development outcome better. Now that's what we have been arguing both conceptually, and there are empirical studies done quite a bit on this. So just very briefly, what are GPN actors? Now, basically GPN, global production networks, are defined by lead firms. Each network is defined by one lead firm. A lead firm is a firm that can define the market or the product or both. So this could be a brand name company you know of, whatsoever, whether it's the Dell or the IBM or is in service industry, is the bank or what have you. And they work with a number of strategic partners, suppliers, and so on and so forth. So you can see a whole chain of firms related to each other, right? And they are competing together as one team against other network as well. So when we talked about strategic coupling of regions into global production networks, we think it's kind of a mutual process, because when regions get plugged into global production networks, then those lead firms manage to benefit from regional assets, tend to do better, tend to be more profitable, higher productivity, maybe technologically more advanced. On the one hand, can tap into maybe cheaper cost regions. On the other hand, can tap into regions with greater knowledge capabilities. So in that case, those GPN will grow fast. And the regions that sort of connect to the GPN tend also to benefit through employment creation, spillover effects, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, if you understand a bit more about this GPN actors imperative and the nature of the regional development process, then you will say this seems to be a mutually complementary process. So how can we make it work for regional development, right? First, I have to say this dynamic, the strategic coupling in itself cannot be thought of as a static equilibrium concept. Means once coupled, let's say one region in Asia coupled into the textile and garment industry, right, making lots of, Nike shoes. All Nike shoes used to be made in Dongguan, let's say China. Yeah, so you can't see it as permanent. It's not forever. So it will change. It's the coupling is a kind of temporary state, all right, fitting at that particular historical period whereby the regional assets are complementary to GPN imperatives. So there are several possibilities of change. One is that over time there will be decoupling going on. As, for example, labor cost goes up, new firms form, or lead firms may decide to unplug from the region, so you have decoupling going on. And sometimes it can be quite devastating in some of the studies shown in some of the developing economies. If you like, when a whole chain of sort of multinationals leave their outsourcing or their direct presence, regional economies collapse. So in that sense, decoupling dynamics could be very serious. And it's important to learn what needs to be done to make sure that a region does not really collapse after that. And of course, there are also very good possibilities of recoupling. If here we are really focusing on the regional makers, regional policy communities. If they're doing the right thing, even a region decoupled today from a particular set of production networks, that region may still be able to recouple successfully in the near future. Now, this is typically a GPN how it looks like. Say, on the right-hand side, you can think of a production network whereby this is, say, Panasonic from Japan as the lead firm, and Panasonic has various operations in different parts of Asia, and each of those blue dots will be locating in a particular region in those countries. Normally, it will be regions that offer very good regional assets. Yeah? So in that sense, we see how all of those blue dots and the regions they represent get sort of connected through the ways in which, say, Panasonic organizes its production network. We can do the same when European firm or American firm and so on and so forth. But I hope you get a sense of how this kind of above national level networks kind of sort of put its legs down to the individual regions. Now, all of these blue dots do not necessarily mean foreign direct investment, do not necessarily mean Panasonic operated factories. It may be a third-party supplier, but part of Panasonic's global production networks. We call them strategic partners or global suppliers, and so on and so forth. Yeah, could be domestic firms. So when a domestic firm in, say, Vietnam plug into Panasonic's, which is probably less likely Vietnam, but if you look at Korea, I will imagine that that Korean firm, the blue dot in Korea is likely to be a Korean firm collaborating with Panasonic. So in my earlier work, we looked at regional development in relation to strategic coupling and sort of came up with, for the case of East Asia, 3 types of these kind of coupling mechanisms. One is to think of international partnership. A region can try to develop partnership by building strong domestic firms and compelling those firms to collaborate, partner with lead firms in global production networks, and we call it functional coupling. There are other regions in Asia that try to develop indigenous innovation, and in so doing try to sort of go through a mode of organic coupling, means growing from within, and in so doing sort of develop its own global production networks and radio out. You can think of that as typically Samsung Electronics example, all right? Samsung being indigenous to South Korea. Third is production platforms, which is more structural coupling in nature, tends to be disadvantaging the region because in this mode, the region served merely as a production platform, and we see quite a lot of that in Asia. Many of the East Asian regions tend to be plugging into global production networks as just low-cost production platforms. And this, I think, this table gives you some sense of the importance of all three types in column: international partnership, indigenous innovation, and production platform. I think more importantly, I just want to say that if you look at the regional trajectories, all right, the highlighted ones, if you look at the regional trajectories, you will say that international partnership offers distinctive regional assets. All right, you must have something distinctive and strong so that lead firms in global production networks are interested to engage in a partnership. And in the case of Taiwan, Hsinchu area and Taipei area, the northern part, and that works out well. If you look at indigenous innovation, then the case of Seoul metropolitan area is again good example. Finally, production platform leads to it's only generic regional assets, and it tends to lead to external dependency. And because of that, the likelihood of decoupling is also high, which means it will lead to some kind of instability, even though those regions seem to be doing well. But as economic activities get moved out of those regions because of higher costs over time and or lack of markets, then those regions may suffer. Just very quickly show you, not empirical, but just sort of on a map how this looks like. All right, I've just shown you some examples of Seoul, Taipei, and then each of the three forms. All right, international partnership and strategic coupling, we see that happening in the case of, say, Taipei, Hsinchu as a sort of high growth region within Taiwan in the ICT industry. All right. I can only be very brief here. There are many studies done on this and looking at Taiwan's ICT firms, both in terms of electronics manufacturing service provider, EMS, as well as ODM, original design manufacturing. Taiwan today hosts the world's largest EMS, and which is Honghai, if you know, Foxconn, that assembles iPhone. As well as ODMs that manufacture some 95% of world's notebooks. So some 95% of all the notebooks now are all manufactured by 5 Taiwanese firms, which are headquartered in those regions. So in that sense, they partner with the brand name holders, whether it's HP or Dell or what have you. And that kind of connection allowed the region to develop as well. Indigenous innovation, you think of Seoul metropolitan, where some of Korea's largest chaebols are based, means conglomerates, and those chaebols have developed strong indigenous technological capability, partly to do with the developmental state in the past, during which domestic firms were specifically chosen, as you may know, to go into specific industries. So Samsung was specifically chosen to go into semiconductors. So today Samsung is the world's largest maker of memory chips and a few other things as well, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of organic mode. It's not because of a lead firm sort of coming in to partner with domestic firm, but sort of growing domestically, but move out. So today, many of these large chaebols, Hyundai, Samsung, LG, have their own global production networks. They are the lead firms. And I bet in America, if you ask some people now, LG, they have no ideas that it's a Korean firm, right? They probably think it's American, no? Okay, production platform, many, but I'm just picking some examples of, if you look at the Jiangsu province, there are lots of production sites here from Shanghai on the extremely right. If you go inland, there are lots of foreign factories, foreign firms going in, but producing for other foreign firms. So it could be Taiwanese firms in China, like Kunshan here. Kunshan is where large number of notebook computers are actually assembled, and they are almost all by Taiwanese, but for all sorts of brand names we know of, whether it's Apple or HP and so on. So in that sense, you have the global production networks going there, as well as the component makers, yeah, whether it's the hard disk drive, the memories, and the parts, and so on. So all of this together form a very sort of diverse set of networks. And the region benefit in terms of offering sort of access to a good cost employment, and so on, and also experience in manufacturing some of these high-tech products. But the relationship remains fairly structural in terms of the coupling relationship, because there are very few domestic firms which are capable of doing this. It's foreign firms dominating those industries. And if you look at textile and garment, or shoe, or some other industries in Guangdong province, for example, again, you will have some of those examples. South Korean, Taiwanese shoemakers in Guangdong, or Hong Kong shoemakers in Guangdong, but again, making for all sorts of foreign brands, so on and so forth. In Southeast Asia, near where I am, same thing happens to Malaysia. If you look at Selangor or Penang up there, hosting quite big electronics, but again, they are structurally coupled in the electronics global industry, global production networks. Same goes to Bangkok, and Rayon is in automobile industry. But again, Thailand doesn't have its own automobile industry. So invite foreign firms, largely Japanese today, more with some Europeans as well as the suppliers all go in. So you have, again, externally sort of coming in global production networks. It does lead to development at the regional level, Rayon, but it remains structural in nature. So in that sense, as you can tell, because of this different mode of strategic coupling, there could be dark sides of strategic coupling. The coupling that leads to more problems than benefits. It is possible. So in this table, I've given you some sense of, very briefly, what it can mean when it comes to a strategic coupling between GPN and region. All right, it can lead to certain ruptures when suddenly you have disinvestment, exit of foreign firms, or financial risk. When a lead firm decides in financial trouble, the whole network, right, will lose the deal and sort of get shut out of the market. Within the region, it also leads to crowding out effects with regard to other sort of global network-related firms. It leads to sometimes political issues because of different sort of coalition. Some are more in favor of working with global capital, some are not. It leads to friction, such as value capture is never even. So again, labor may get too exploited, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the problems typically we think of as the dark sides of strategic coupling. In a way, that's where policy needs to be developed to remedy some of these situations. And also sometimes there are conflicting GPN and regional logics. A region may want to engage in industrial upgrading. All right. So in China, for example, China wants to engage in industrial upgrading, want to upgrade its industry. It doesn't want to do the cheap, low-end stuff. But in terms of GPN logic, the lead firms would still like to only put their sort of low-cost production activities in China. So how do you reconcile the two sort of different logics? And we see many regions on Earth having these kind of issues. And of course, the dynamics of strategic coupling in itself will be shifting, eventually settling down to an appropriate form of coupling, and then over time, conditions change, and then you disarticulate again and recouple again. So, okay, maybe I'll just skip this one. This is a case of China. Oh, okay. I just briefly say that the changing mode can be seen in the semiconductor industry, for example. If you look at South Korea and Taiwan, these two are very, very significant players in the global semiconductor industry. Apart from Intel now, if you look at the global semiconductor industry market output, apart from Intel, the Japanese producers are already sort of fallen behind the Korean producers. And then the two Taiwanese firms which are making chips for others is TSMC and UMC, are also top 10 in the world. So all our smartphone, the chips are designed by American firms or British, but not manufactured. The manufacture is done by Taiwanese guys, TSMC or UMC. Now, if you look at the way in which the two regions couple into this global semiconductor industry is quite interesting. Originally, it was foreign firm dominated. Right? When both economies started industrialization, there was extensive presence of American, the National Semiconductor, the Fairchild, and so on, and Motorola went into both of the economies. In those days, it was FDI driven. But over time, both economies developed indigenous firms working with those foreign firms. Eventually, those foreign firms exited. So that today, if you look at both of the economies, they have engaged in organic coupling, but then they have contrasting outcome. Korea went into kind of what we call IDM, integrated device manufacturing, means you both have the brand like Samsung as well as make the chip. Whereas in the case of Taiwan, it decides not to do IDM. The IDMs are not successful. You never heard of, the DRAM makers and chip makers, but the foundry makers are very successful. So TSMC is the world-class company making latest generation of chips for other firms. Even Apple lately want to dump Samsung. Samsung makes for Apple chips. And Apple has been trying to get rid of Samsung, or dependency on Samsung. However, when Apple wants to get to a TSMC and say, can I buy over one of your factories so it's dedicated to making my chips, the Taiwanese say, no, because I have to serve all the other, what we call fabless chip designers. No fabrication capacity, but design. It means high-tech designers, which are normally in Silicon Valley. So the moral of the story is that I think both regions have started structural coupling, over time evolved through organic, and then now again reposition themselves. One is again much more advanced in indigenous innovation. Taiwan is more in terms of international partnership with leading fabless chip makers, chip designers, not makers. So this semiconductor industry is very special because it gives us a sense of how regions can develop into this kind of high-tech, high-tech industries. Now, a recent study by Zhu and John Pickles look at the case of apparel industry in China. China apparel industry used to be in the coastal region. We know that, which in turn leads to tremendous growth through employment and hundreds of millions of migration workers, right? Migrate from different parts of China to coastal regions to work in those enormous factories, tens of thousands employed per factory, right? So they make most of the stuff that you find in Walmart, Kmart, whatever marts in the US, right? Today, China doesn't want too much of that, right? It wants to upgrade. It doesn't want, the coastal region is getting more prosperous. So China is trying to push for this kind of going west geographically, move, or going out means kick them out, try to take the high road, all right? If you look at the sort of geographical distribution, the coastal region was the wealthy, the beginning of the location of this apparel GPN presence. But today, more of these factories are also trying to move inland in order to tap into, again, cheaper sources of labor for, in a way, to continue the kind of structural dependency, in a way, on global production networks in this industry. So China's examples in this particular industry remains sort of locked into a particular mode of coupling. Okay, so what are the policy implications? First is to know that the changing mode of coupling needs to be understood because there are different pitfalls, associated benefits and pitfalls. We cannot say, a region is always good if you engage in indigenous innovation and organic coupling. Maybe nothing will happen, all right? And hence, structural platform is a bad thing. Well, even Korea and Taiwan started structural platform. Singapore, of course, also started, but we are kind of not a region, so I don't count Singapore, yeah? Second is for us to be always critical, to be aware that regional institutions play extremely important role in engaging and enabling this coupling to take place. And this sort of involvement of regional institutions is a necessary condition. And how to do that? I mean, is primarily to deal with collective action in order to mitigate the dark sides I've just shown you briefly earlier, and also to sort of bring out a more balanced form of regional development. It need not be the entire region plugged into global production networks. You may have domestic capacity develop, but also be mindful of regional variation resources, because not all regions have the same endowment. We know that, whether it's the people, the institution, the natural resources, and so on and so forth. So in a way, I would like to argue there are sector-specific industrial policies that can be pursued in a kind of GPN-led regional development. So we don't think of regional development as development by the region itself, but regional development through engagement, plugging in with global production networks. And if that's the case, then there are certain sectors that region A that can consider to develop. So what are the key considerations when it comes to this kind of GPN-led regional development policy? Okay, first is it's important to move beyond thinking of national. I think there is too often obsession with, we need a whole country must do this thing. The country that cannot do this thing. Only certain regions in this country may have the necessary condition to plug in, to engage in this industry or that industry. So that is the first point to be made. Niches must be found in specific regions of a large country in particular. Second is to recognize the need for understanding detailed knowledge of the global production networks. This is in terms of policy practice, because again, there are far too many policy makers communities who just want some quick policy recommendation. Just give taxation, tax benefits, or just build roads, infrastructure. Yeah, you do all this, but therefore what? If you want to target not in the good old days of industrial targeting, but here we are talking about you have to have a deep sense of, if you were to sort of get involved in this kind of industry, semiconductors, what do you must have? It may not be about tax benefits, because the capital equipment is so expensive. Perfect fabrication plant is over $1 billion. But it may be to do with simple things like stability of water supply and electricity, because every electricity jump, the whole batch of chips will be gone immediately, right? So you can't afford that kind of instability. So very few developing countries can host a large wafer fabrication plant for that reason. So semiconductor is very peculiar. Then what about, you say, automobile? All right, you want to plug into automobile? Sure. Then you have to look at, again, the specificities of that automobile global production networks. Promoting new domestic capacity, that's very important, because, as I've alluded earlier, there is differential value capture. So in some of the forms like structural coupling, the value capture tends to be lower, right? The brand name holders in Europe, in North America, after making that piece of garment, selling it, or this Ralph Lauren, will benefit from that sale, right? But the actual cost of this piece of garment maybe is only $1 to $2, all right? And how much can that factory worker somewhere in Bangladesh earn? So it's very little, the value capture. So more value capture can take place if there is more design work, for example, at the level of production, so that then the design work can incorporate into that piece price, each piece of the garment that a factory make for Ralph Lauren. Yeah? So in that sense, promoting domestic capacity such as design capability, ideally, of course, a knowledge intensive capability will be important. But of course, all this depends on national resources and so on and so forth. A fourth point is to say developing global supply base. You need a combination of local and foreign firms. You can't have all this foreign, because if it's all foreign, then it becomes structural dependent, right? There is no point of just getting all foreign firms and you have no local firms. So, and it's unlikely to be sustainable over time. So you need a balance of that. A balance in such a way that you hopefully develop some local firms that learn from foreign firms in these production networks, and in so doing, hopefully grow bigger and over time. And the Taiwanese has done a very good job in that, so that the local firms have eventually grown to be major global players in some of those industries. There are, of course, some generic things that can be learned. Facilitating trade in production inputs and intermediate goods is very important. As we know, countries generally don't like to open their trade completely. Even free trade agreement has been signed. Country governments, particularly in developing countries, still tend to be quite difficult when it comes to custom duties and all these non-trade barriers. But if you want to engage in global production networks, you have to let intermediate goods flow, because intermediate goods and services are what lubricate the whole production system. Without intermediate goods, you can't have global production networks. Yeah? So in that sense, that needs to be facilitated through trade policies. And finally, regional economies can leverage on GPNs to access global markets. By definition, GPNs have global access, so to speak, market reach-wise. And because there is always the lead firm that has certain market positioning in terms of branding or in terms of market power. So regional economies, local firms can tap onto the presence of this in order to gain global access. Okay, before I end, I just sort of quickly on the right-hand column, sort of give you a sense of what kind of regional policy practice we can derive from this. Now, the column on the left came from UNCTAD 2013 World Investment Report, which is about global value chains and how you can have principal policy actions at the national level. So I've sort of scaled it down to regional level, subnational regional level. There are 5 components on the left: embedding GPNs in development strategy. Okay, I've put it down, sort of expanded it a bit bigger, okay? First element is about embedding GPNs in development strategies, all right? Development is not just about development. You have to incorporate GPNs into regional development. How? So you've got to understand current regional capability and position in global industries better, align the endowments with targeted industry, be realistic and achievable goals, be mindful of race to the bottom kind of, or the structural mode of coupling I was talking about. Second is to do enabling participation in GPNs. So regional policies that facilitate trade, international trade in intermediate goods, very important, allowing investments, foreign investments, domestic investment and so on. National policy incentives perhaps needed, certain maybe special tax regimes granted to those special regions of the country, so that those regions, if you like, well, in the good old Deng Xiaoping China's way, get prosper first, so to speak. Third is to say building domestic productive capacity. National, regional institutional support for capability development, very important. Again, we understand in the national innovation, regional innovation system literature that clustering is extremely useful in developing linkages, which in turn allows for knowledge development and which again create the right base capability for strategic coupling to take place. Final two, providing a strong environmental and social and governance framework. So that one is more to do with, again, minimizing the dark sides of strategic coupling. You need to engage civic society, social dialogues to make sure that, you know, the fact that many of the operations in the region tends to be sort of part of a global production, different global production network seems to be threatening. People need to understand better. And of course, there are possibilities of environmental pollutions and, if you like, environmental naughtiness being exported through these kind of global production networks, right? So you can think of typically supermarkets elsewhere in large countries in the US or in the UK. They will source from developing country suppliers, but they don't want to care how they do this, and hence there is issue of environmental ramifications, again, through maybe appropriately develop corporate social responsibility programs, as well as allowing NGOs to monitor some of this situation will enable less of this sort of, if you like, environmental or social or gendered exploitations. And finally, about synergizing trade and investment policies. And this is important because sometimes, you know, in many economies, national, regional governments, the trade side and the investment side, they don't talk to each other. All right, they seem to be different people. The trade side is to do with liberalization, investment side is to do with investment incentives. So this needs to be harmonized better. Also develop stronger cross-regional linkages within the country. And of course, industry associations and intermediaries, public-private consortium need to be developed to facilitate some of these activities. So the key consideration when it comes to the GPN-led regional development practice is to engage. As a practice, you engage your people, the people from the region who have worked abroad or elsewhere. These we call transnational communities. And these people have connections to global production networks. And Taiwan is very successful in that sense, tapping into its technologists working in Silicon Valley and so on and so forth. Second is about policy credibility and institutional consistency. Finally, I think regional development policyholders need to be pragmatic. I think at the end of the day, this thing can't be too dogmatic. I mean, in a way, global conditions often change, and major industry may shift. So again, policymakers need to be cognizant of all of that. So in conclusion, I just want to say, in this paper, I've given you a very short and quick sort of introduction to the idea of strategic coupling. But primarily, I want to show you that regional development should be thought of as, in today's globalizing context, as development within the global economy, rather than just regional development on its own. And because of that, I will argue that regional-global intersection is the primary mechanism, and it should be one of the key sort of dimension of our research when it comes to understanding regional development in both regional studies and regional science as the field. So I have a quote from Asher Min long time ago that to say that we should go beyond parochial optimism in regional policy and practice. We should engage with the dynamics of strategic coupling in GPNs. As Asher Min said long time ago, that it is vital that an approach based on mobilizing the wealth of the regions does not degenerate into localist sentiments. There is a risk that the institutionalist turn in regional thought and practice reinforces the parochial optimism centered on the belief that building local capabilities might be sufficient for establishing a privileged position within global networks. In a way, it is not sufficient. Just building local capability is not enough. It must be local capabilities for what? For what kind of coupling? With what kind of global industries? And once you have identified, developed deeper knowledges of all of this, then the chances for regional development to take place in a sustainable, high growth, good manner may be higher. Thank you.